Hey guys, welcome to video 20 for Mr. McGee's 9th grade biology class at Arizona School for the Arts. Today we're going to talk about a basic overview of photosynthesis and respiration. So this will be the first level of detail about these two really important and really complicated processes. So remember, we've talked before about how energy flows through an ecosystem, right? And this is a pretty complicated diagram of how that happens. But basically what I want you to see here is that the ultimate source of energy is the sun, and then from the sun we get producers, and then consumers, and then other things like decomposers, etc. But every time that energy is transferred, some of it gets used by the body of the organism that has that energy, but then the majority of it's lost as heat. So we get sunlight, producers convert that sunlight into the parts of their bodies, those body parts get eaten by other things survive and live, etc. Right. Alright, so we can boil all of that down into one very simple flowchart. We start out with the sun, which through photosynthesis produces a sugar called glucose. And then that sugar can get broken down by respiration to produce something called ATP, which is then utilized by a cell to produce energy. So ATP is a molecule we've talked about before, adenosine triphosphate. It's a little molecule that stores energy. And we'll talk about that in more detail in upcoming videos. So let's talk about photosynthesis. This is the most basic way to think of photosynthesis. So I've got a picture of a little plant here with the sun and other things going on. Right. So we have this balanced chemical equation that we've talked about before, which basically tells us all the molecules that go into photosynthesis and all of the molecules that are produced as a result of photosynthesis. So let's start here. So CO2. We get 6 molecules of CO2, that's carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide, if you look at this chart, enters the plant's cells through small pores in the leaves. So there are these tiny little pores in the leaves that take in air from the atmosphere, which includes carbon dioxide. And then that carbon dioxide is a raw material part of photosynthesis. Water is also a raw material. And as everybody probably knows, water comes from the soil through the plant's roots, and then is transported up to the rest of the plant's body to be used as part of photosynthesis. So a plant takes 6 molecules of CO2, 6 molecules of water, and then creates 1 molecule of glucose, and then 6 molecules of oxygen. That oxygen is a waste product. It's poisonous to the process of photosynthesis. The plant gets rid of it through small pores in its leaves. Right. That's photosynthesis in a nutshell. So you should be able to tell me each of the raw materials in photosynthesis and what part of the plant collects them or releases them. As far as the glucose gets shipped to all parts of the plant where it can be used later. Or a large part of the glucose gets stored in the stem and in the roots, depending on the type of plant it is, to be used later. So let's take a closer look at the actual machinery inside plant cells that are responsible for photosynthesis. So this is a plant leaf, and if you look very closely at this picture, you can see the individual cells that make up the leaf. And then if we zoom in there, each of those cells is full of these small green, almost look like cells themselves things, right? These little arrows are pointing to the chloroplasts that are found in plant cells. And remember, a ways back we talked about endosymbiosis theory. We think the chloroplast was at one time a free-living bacteria that came to live inside the cells of a eukaryote. And that relationship is so old and that relationship is so intimate that now you can't separate plant cells from the chloroplasts in them. Here's another image of those chloroplasts up a little closer so you can see that the parts of the plant that are responsible for photosynthesis are loaded with chloroplasts. And then this diagram shows you the different components. So you do need to know that a chloroplast has its own structure, and you need to know what that structure is all about. So surrounding each chloroplast, there's something called the outer membrane. Within that is another inner membrane. And this is one of the reasons why we think that chloroplasts were once free-living cells. So the free-living cell would have had its own membrane, and that still remains as the inner membrane. But then when it moved into the plant cell, it would have been surrounded by another membrane, the membrane of the eukaryote cell that it occupied. And so that would have given it two membranes. Then inside of the chloroplast is a fluid that's called the stroma. It's a very important part of photosynthesis, so we'll talk about that later. And then floating in the stroma are these sort of sacs of membrane that have pigments like chlorophyll, the green pigment in plants that's responsible for photosynthesis. And if you can imagine them being like hollow pancakes, they're sort of flattened sacs of membrane with green pigments in them. And if you had a stack of pancakes, right, everybody's seen that, everybody's like, oh, I'll take 17 pancakes, and you get like 17 pancakes on the plate, you get this big stack. A stack of thylakoids, that stack of pancake-shaped membranes, is called a granum. So you have one thylakoid, and then stacks of them together are called a granum. That's singular. There could be multiple grani within a chloroplast. So is that confusing enough? Probably. Okay, so that's photosynthesis in a nutshell. Now let's move on to cellular respiration. And ultimately we're going to take a look at two types of cellular respiration. The first type is anaerobic, which means that it happens without oxygen. It's a cellular respiration that happens as part of the respiration that produces all the energy in your cells. It's sort of like the first step in that process. And it's an inefficient process. It produces a little bit of ATP, but not a whole lot. And then there's the aerobic part of cellular respiration, which uses oxygen, and that produces a lot of ATP. So most of the ATP that we utilize in our cells, most of the ATP that respiration produces comes from the aerobic part of that respiration. But without the anaerobic part, we can't get to the aerobic part. So the anaerobic part of the process has to happen first, then the aerobic part of the process can happen. We'll see more about that later. All right, so let's take a look at aerobic cellular respiration. This is a bunny, so it would be using cellular respiration in its body to produce energy. So first of all, it would be taking in oxygen, 6 molecules of oxygen to be precise, and 1 molecule of glucose. And then in the cells of its body, that molecule of glucose would be broken down, in part using the oxygen, to create some waste products. And those waste products would be CO2, which he exhales from his little bunny lungs through his little bunny nose, and water, which is also part of the exhalation. So you probably don't notice this except on a really cold day. You give off quite a bit of water every time you exhale, every time you breathe out. You notice this on a cold day because it's warmer than the air that surrounds you, and so it looks like a vapor as it leaves. You know that thing that Braxton does where he does some funky noise and makes this really weird looking face, and then all of a sudden he breathes out something visible, some visible mist? Yeah, that's just him manipulating pressure to produce the same result. Ask him to show it to you sometime. It's a little crazy. Anyway. Oh, I forgot one other thing. So after the bunny is done extracting all this energy, there's some waste that's left. So I put that on the slide too. Solid waste. Different from the metabolic waste, but still worth noting. All right, so let's take a look at what this looks like in a cell. So this image, the one on the bottom right, is a scanning electron image of a typical animal cell. You can see all the parts that are characteristic of animal cells, like lysosomes, the nucleus, a plasma membrane, centrioles, and they're embedded in that animal cell are these, the mitochondria. And I've actually used another higher magnification scanning electron microscope image so you can take a look at that. And again, we think mitochondria were once free-living bacteria-like organisms that became embedded in a larger cell and eventually just lived there. So let's take a look at these in a little bit more detail. So a mitochondria also has an outer membrane and an inner membrane, perhaps indicating that it was once free-living. And in between the outer and the inner membrane is something that's called the intermembrane space. It's the space in between those two membranes. The inner membrane is all folded up, and each little fold is called a cristae, or multiple cristae, or crista, or whatever. I can't remember what it is. Crista, and then cristae. That's what it is. One crista, multiple cristae. And so that's all folded up because that allows for the inner membrane to have a greater amount of surface area. And that's important because if you look at that inner membrane, it's got all kinds of interesting enzyme complexes embedded in it. Those enzyme complexes are responsible for producing ATP. And so if the inner membrane is folded up into cristae, that makes more space, more surface area available, and therefore more enzyme complexes available inside the little mitochondria, and therefore it can produce more ATP. Now, inside the inner membrane is a special fluid that's called the matrix. Dun, 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 pew, 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 bullet time, and all that. The matrix, that's important too. So here's the diagram of the mitochondria. Outer membrane, inner membrane, intermembrane space in between, the cristae, which are folds of the inner membrane with enzyme complexes embedded in them, and then the matrix. Dun, 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 dun. So how efficient is respiration? Well, respiration captures about 38% of the energy in every molecule of glucose, and about 62% of that energy is lost as heat. Now, this doesn't account for all the energy that's lost as heat when that ATP is then used by the animal. So we still end up losing like 90% of the total energy as heat, but respiration itself captures 38% of it. That doesn't sound like a lot, but just keep in mind that's still much more efficient than a typical automobile. So that's the end of this video. Make sure you complete the corresponding review questions, be prepared to show your notes in class, and as always, here's your bunny of the day with a pancake.